Thank you for joining us. You are watching Talking Success, the hottest talk show on cable in Chicago and sweeping the World Wide Web on YouTube and other platforms. So I'm just glad that you take an opportunity to tune in today. We've got another exciting segment on ADOS, American Descendants of Slavery. You know, it's a hot subject. We're dealing with reparations, so I've got the lead organizer here in Chicago, Marlon Waston, with me today. Thank you, Marlon, for coming on. And the last segment we did, we kind of, you remember where we left off?
Yeah, so I think we were talking about black capitalism in a sense. And,
right.
You know,
right. So we're going to pick up on that on a minute. But for those that didn't see the other two shows, kind of give us a little background on the ADOS movement in general, how it caught on fire earlier this year. And it really caught on fire earlier this year, and what's going on here in Chicago.
So ADOS is American Descendants of Slavery. It's an ethnicity. Not only is it an ethnicity, it's a political movement that started via online with Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore. And all over the country, people have been taking what they've been teaching in terms of ADOS being our ethnicity and understanding our condition based on the data. People have been taking that all over the country and starting meetup groups, chapters, et cetera, to advocate for black ADOS people in their local areas.
And you said they've been disseminating some good information. So,
really good information.
Keith, we need to bring up 4 and 5 so people can get a visual on who we're talking about. Antonio Moore, his program is on every Friday, 9 o'clock Chicago time. And we also have Yvette Carnell. She's on every Monday and Wednesday at 9 o'clock Chicago time. I think she's down in Atlanta. So you got the bulk of your information from Yvette, and also from Antonio Moore with Tone Talk. Thanks, Keith. So go ahead and pick up where I cut you off.
Yeah, so, and that's what ADOSChicago is. It's an organization full of people that got inspired and fired up from the data that Yvette was sharing. And we took that data and took that concept, ADOS concept, and created a political organization that's designed to advocate for ADOS people specifically in Chicago. And it's happening all over the country. People all over the United States of America are meeting up weekly, visiting their local politicians, you know, putting together presentations and studies, and these are mostly people who have never been involved in politics. I don't have a political background. I have an entrepreneurial background. So that kind of shows you the power of a media. Yeah. And when they had the HR 40 hearing, a lot of our people in the ADOS movement from all over, they were there.
Came down to Washington D.C.
They were there. Yeah. Yeah, and so that's what this information is doing, is helping people understand our condition a lot better. Because I said this on your last show, Nellie Fuller says, if you don't understand white supremacy, everything you think you know will confuse you. Right. And I take that a step further and say, if you don't understand the data, everything you think you know will confuse you. Right. So understanding the data has just gotten people engaged and fired up all over the country. And again, usually it's people who weren't politicos prior to the information. I wasn't involved in the political scene. I've always been a do-for-selfer, as we call it, a person that was entrepreneurial and using that as a means to serve my community. Now I'm in a totally different lane because I understand the data now. And I understand being an entrepreneur is okay, but that's not what what the black community lacks. Being an entrepreneur is not something we lack. And I sought to serve my community in that space because I thought that that's where we were lacking. But again, understanding the data, understanding
you keep saying
studies,
data, and the majority of data is coming from William Darty.
Well, the majority of the data is coming from William Darty as it relates to intergenerational wealth, or what we call the wealth disparity. Right. He's done a bunch of studies called The Color of Wealth, and it shows the differences in median net worths, household incomes of Black Americans, Black Americans, blacks who are non-American, and white and Hispanic people. And it showed a pretty dismal picture for black people whose ancestors were slaves in this country. It shows a very dismal picture for us even as it relates to compared to other black folk who come from other countries. We're in a very interesting place in that our median net worth, and I'm talking specifically about ADOS people in America, is at $1,700. The median net worth for white America is at $160,000. We're at $1,700, they're at $160,000. Our net worth, black America, ADOS America, is projected to be zero by 2050. So we're in a very, very dismal place. And Dr. Darity is the one that's been able to get that information and share it with people.
What about all this talk about buying power? It makes black people feel like something wrong. They're spending too much money.
That's what you would assume. But my parents always told me consider the source. So that study that's created the term buying power, and that suggests that black people have $1 trillion in spending power. You got to understand that study comes from Nielsen. Nielsen is doing the study for producers, like Nike and Colgate and
right.
people that
people
create
that's trying
products.
to sell stuff.
People that are trying to sell stuff. So what those producers do is they hire Nielsen to go and see what people are buying and what triggers them to purchase certain products. And then the producers will take that information and create marketing campaigns around the information that Nielsen found out. So for example, the Nielsen study found out that black people, we are more prone to buy products that have messages on them, or messages of equality or equity or social messages. So for instance, Nielsen found that out, and just as hypothetical, what they'll do is they'll get that information back to the producer, and then Colgate will say, oh, black people are triggered by social movements. So let's create a campaign for the Colgate, our new Colgate brand, and every time you purchase this particular Colgate product, we'll donate $1 to the United Negro College Fund. Now they got you. So that's what the Nielsen study isn't something that's showing you your, economic prowess. It's just showing the producer where you spend your money on and what you spend your money on and what causes you to spend money. So it's not what people think it is.
But see, one thing you never hear is how much spending power. We know it's a wealth gap, right?
It's
a disparity.
Yeah, a wealth gulf.
Right.
Wealth gulf is a lot larger. Economists say it will take 226 years for black America to catch white America. And that's if white America sits still. It'll take 226 years. So the wealth disparity is abysmal. But I want to get back to this spending power scenario. So understand the source, consider the source, understand why they're doing what they're doing. And then when you hear these things, actually read the study. If you read the study, what you'll find out is over 60%, close to 70% of the money spent in black America is spent on housing and food. We spend more money on grains and vegetables than anybody. The study breaks this $1 trillion so-called spending power down, and it shows you where you spend money at. Another big thing or big myth in black America, amongst black Americans, is we overspend on Jordans. We always get the critique that why we spend so much money on shoes, why we spend so much money on clothes. Well, the Nielsen study also discovered that 2.8% is spent on apparel and services. Apparel, that's shoes and clothes. So there's not an overspending in black America. We don't have worse spending habits than white America. In fact, we have the same spending habits as white America. And in some instances, when you control for income, we have better spending habits than white America. We're more conservative in spending than white America. But with these studies, if you don't understand the data, you would think differently. And I want people to understand that $1 trillion in spending power, first of all, you need to understand what spending power is. If you have a $50,000 credit card, that's part of your spending power. If you can buy a $20,000 car, that's part of your spending power. It's not telling you how much money you actually have. It's telling you how much you are able to spend. And what I want people to understand is we're 15% of the American population, and we are said to only have $1 trillion in spending power when there's $110 trillion in wealth in the hands of America. So we have less than 1% of what's
Oh, okay.
Of
See,
what-
that brings it back in perspective.
That puts it in perspective. You're 15% of the population, but you have the spending power of less than 1% of the available monies that's in the hands of American people nationwide. That's an issue. That's not something to laud. That's not something to be excited about. That should really piss you off. If you've been here for 400 years and you can only manage to have less than 1% of the actual money that's available, that's in the hands of Americans as a spending power, that should get you upset. If we had a $15 trillion spending power, that's a different conversation.
Right.
But we got 1%, less than 1%. That's a very serious problem. But you don't know that because, again, consider the source. The person, the entity that created the study, is presenting it to you in a way that makes you feel good, so you can continue to patronize these certain producers as they craft products that fit your propensities.
So now you can take the spending power connected to wealth gap, or you said, what did you call it?
The wealth gulf
Gulf.
is bigger than the gap.
So let's go back and connect that to the ADOS movement in terms of the reason why reparations is necessary, because of those things that created the what do you call it? The
Accrued disadvantage.
The accrued disadvantage.
White America has an accrued advantage, meaning if you know anything about compound interest, you know how money compounds over time. Black America has an accrued disadvantage. We've had the opposite effect of compound interest. We have compound interest in a negative. So, and what I mean by that is the bottom half of Black America is worth less than $1. The bottom half. That's over 20 million people that are worth collectively less than $1. That's the accrued disadvantage.
Right. So this has been set up systematically. One thing, in talking to people that don't look like us, they're citizens of the United States of America. The government was responsible for some of the things we've talked about and going to talk about. So as a result of being a citizen and a taxpayer, whatever debt that the United States of America has, your tax dollars go to pay that debt.
Absolutely.
Now, if you don't want, I'm trying to see how to say this. If you don't, they make it seem like it's personal, like you're taking something away from them.
Yeah, I get where you're going. So the thing is, a lot of people try and say, particularly a lot of white people, that I don't want to pay reparations for something I didn't do. But the thing is, you inherit a country's dreams and its deficits. You don't just get to come to a country and inherit its dreams. You inherit the deficits too. So it's very similar to me not wanting to pay for the war in Afghanistan.
Right.
I didn't want to, but that's part of the country's debt.
Right.
And I'm a member of this country, so I have to pay that.
Right.
So, whether whether a white person came, because white people often say, my ancestors came in the late 1800s or the late 1900s, but they were able to come into whiteness, and they were able to come into a country that was already built. Nobody made them come. They came voluntarily.
Right.
So you don't get to come to a country's dreams alone. You got to come to its
And
dreams
then
and its
it's the
deficits.
benefits that they inherited.
Oh yeah.
Generational benefits.
Oh yeah. And even if your parents or your ancestors didn't own slaves, you could always rent a slave. Slaves were for rent.
Right.
And not only that, you had companies and industries that provided things that supported the system of slavery. Slavery was the primary wealth builder in this country. So slaves needed shoes, they needed clothes, they needed tools, they needed all kinds of. They had insurance on slaves, and so industries, even though they may not have been directly slave-owning entities, they provided what was necessary to maintain that system.
And I've been able to do some little research and show where you may not have owned slaves, your relatives, ancestors, but your great-great-grandfather was a blacksmith, and the plantation owner needed horseshoes. So your great-great-grandfather wouldn't have made money making horseshoes to sell to the plantation owner, and he was able to buy some land, and your grandfather inherited the land, and your grandfather recently passed that land on to you.
Yeah. I mean, America created what they call the Homestead Act. And what the Homestead Act was, for European settlers, if you could get to America and you could simply pay a filing fee, they'd give you acres of land. Just give it to you. And 50% of that land is still in the hands of those same families. And the other 50%, I don't know exactly where it's at, but I couldn't imagine it being outside of the hands of white people, so it's probably still in the white community. But this is land that was given to them by the American government. They were able to toil the land. Not only did America give them land, they gave them land grant colleges. Dr. King taught us this. They gave them land grant colleges to be able to mechanize the land and teach them how to mechanize the land, rather, and make it a profitable enterprise, a profitable business. And again, 50% of that land is still in the hands of those same families today. So they've passed that wealth down generation after generation, and they use slaves to toil that land generation after generation. And that's an accrued advantage that's been passed down to white families. While black people, we were given a accrued disadvantage because we were used to create the wealth of those particular families. A lot of people use the analogy, they say the wealth gap is so big because black people were held back for 400 years as white people ran the race, and then 400 years later we were able to, we're here now we're trying to catch them. But Antonio Moore puts it in a different perspective. He says we weren't only held back during the race, we were the shoes they used to run the race. So we were the labor, we were the mules, we were the tools they used to build entities, build cities, and not only companies, not only families, but cities and city roads and municipalities and states. And these states and municipalities and cities are still here. They're still thriving. They're still active. They hadn't gone bankrupt. They're still actively making money. And the primary wealth for those entities came through unpaid slave labor. And so we're saying that because of that accrued advantage that came from the backs of our ancestors and the accrued disadvantages that is put upon us now, we're saying the claim is based on that. And it's not only is it needed because of our wealth condition now, but it's a debt owed. Even if we weren't in an economic genocide, the debt would still be owed. So undergirded with reparations is the fact that it's a debt. You could overlay it with the fact that we're in the economic genocide that was created from what created the debt. But again, even if we were doing well economically, the debt would still be owed. And that's the primary objective of what ADOS is doing.
Okay. So looking at post, and you talked about slavery, I've been doing a lot of focusing on post, like Reconstruction.
Correct.
The advantages. Talk about some of the advantages and some of the progress we made during Reconstruction up to the Great Compromise. That's when things went left or right.
Yeah. So even post-slavery, we still were able to, even when when General Sherman did the Field Order Act 15, where they actually started issuing land from North Carolina to Florida, 40 acres for each family of 4, and a used war mule to help them toil the land. Even after that, an assassination of Lincoln happened, and they started to confiscate that land and all those kinds of things and stop the issuance of it. Black people were still some kind of way able to purchase over 15, I think, million acres of land or something like that, a crazy amount of land. These are folks straight out of slavery, no education, and all they know how to do is work and toil land, right? They were still able to purchase large swaths of land. But because of the assassination of Lincoln and the subsequent to that convict leasing, the institution of convict leasing, the institution of black codes, and the ramping up of white supremacy, the Klan, the Citizens Council, that land was largely stolen. And some people say it was sold, some of it was sold, but it was sold out of intimidation. I've read stories of people, white families going to a black farm and just telling the owner of a farm that this is my farm now. These are my mules now. I'll let you take a few dollars for it. I'll give you $1 or $2 for it, but it's mine now. And families, the black families just leave.
Right.
They have no recourse. They have no protection. My family had a very similar story. My mother tells me a story about they're from Macon, Georgia, and her grandfather had to leave Georgia because of some terrorism by some white families.
Yeah.
I think he shot a white man or killed him or
Right,
something like that,
right.
and they had to leave.
Right.
So the land that was amassed, it was subsequently taken and given right back to the hands of white people.
Right.
And then we could fast forward to say the 1930s. We can get to the 1930s, where that's popularly known as the Great Depression. And the Great Depression happened because white people had a home ownership level of like 30-something% or something like that, and that's considered an economic emergency when you have home ownership levels at those home ownership rates at those levels. And so when America saw that white people were largely poor, what they did is they rolled out all the governmental stops. They pulled out the New Deal, the Fair Deal, the American Works Program, the FHA loans, GI Bill, so on and so forth. And all those proposals and all those government interventions created the white middle class.
That's welfare, ain't it?
That's welfare. That's exactly what it is. It's welfare. But those systems, those policies largely excluded black people. So it created the middle class in white America, and subsequent to that, the wealthy class and elite class, and the black American population was again left stranded. So this is why we see the accrued advantage that was given to white people via government intervention.
So you're saying that the government had the Fair Housing Administration to make loans, mm-hmm. guaranteed loans, mm-hmm. that the banks would make. They were guaranteed, so the banks didn't care because if they foreclosed, correct. The government would guarantee they would get their money. But if your grandfather went in to try to get one of the loans, they wouldn't give it to him.
He'd be denied. Not only that, even the veterans that went and served in different wars, when they tried to use the GI Bill, or which would send them to school, or the veterans home loan, they were denied that. So white GIs would come back from the war, and they would continue the building of the white middle class via these governmental programs. Or the black GIs would come back from the war, and they were excluded from these things. So this is why we see today that we have a net worth of $1,700, and white America has a net worth of $1,600.
So we find in discussing with open-minded white folks that they didn't know about how the government was complicit in providing loans, guaranteed loans, to white folks, and making certain programs available to white folks that wasn't available to black folks. They under the illusion that we all been in this game or race on an equal footing, mm-hmm. and we have not. That's why sometimes anger may be misdirected towards the group that was the beneficiary of these government programs, but through education, you've been able to show people that you shouldn't have to get upset with white folks. It really ain't their fault that the government made certain things available to them and gave them an advantage that they didn't give black. So it is a black and white issue, but then again, it's not a black and white issue.
Well, white people knew then when the policies were rolling out, they knew, read a book called The Color of Law. It chronicles all...
By Waston.
By Waston, right. It chronicles in all around the country different scenarios where, white people were actively involved in excluding black people from buying homes in equity-rich areas through different covenants and things like that.
Yeah, right.
But today, a lot of white people don't know that history.
They don't know that history.
They don't know that history. So they fall into the concept or the idea of, a lot of people have heard, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Well, my ancestors did it. My ancestors came from Germany in 1920, and they were able to start a business.
I ran across a video on YouTube. They did something out in LaGrange, Illinois, mm-hmm. and they brought Waston in, and they said, well, we wondered why there weren't any blacks, mm-hmm. but they didn't know that the township had set it up what black folks couldn't buy.
Yeah, they set it up through racial covenants, and then a lot of times just plain old terrorism.
Right.
You know, you try to go buy a place, and the Klan would come and just intimidate you out of buying that
Right.
particular place. And even when some white people back then said, you know what, it was some well-meaning white folk, you know,
Right.
not all of them, but some of them were well-meaning, and they said, okay, we're gonna, you know, we don't mind purchasing and being in a community with black people. Well, what the government did is they made those areas that had more than 3 black families, they made those areas what they call red line areas. They made
Right.
them equity poor areas, so there was an incentive for white people to leave those areas,
Right.
which is what we call white flight.
Right.
So those white people who were well-meaning, saying, well, you know, I don't mind living around black folk, the government made it where it was a disincentive. It was an incentive, rather, for them to leave those areas and go to an area where they could purchase homes that excluded black people, and they could build equity, but the black communities couldn't build equity. So that again, that's what we call white flight. Well, now today we have gentrification. The children of those of those white
Right.
people are coming back to those poor areas and buying up the areas and kicking black people out of those areas again.
Here again, we run out of time. So we talked about the color law by Waston, and we didn't get a chance to talk about when affirmative action was white.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
So we got 2 minutes to tell us how.
So again, we briefed it a little bit. So when affirmative action was white, it's basically affirmative action is something that was supposed to be created for black people to help with the disadvantage of slavery,
Right.
et cetera. Well, when affirmative action was white was a book written by Ira Katznelson, and it chronicles when America created government programs specifically for white people to help grow and prosper white communities while excluding black communities.
So they didn't call it affirmative action.
Right.
They didn't call it affirmative action. But we do know about the affirmative action in the 70s. So the reason why you're sharing this with us is that accrued advantages through a program. Advantages were accrued through a program.
Through government intervention.
So in this book, when affirmative action was white, it talks about different programs.
I mean, it chronicles, it paints a very important, potent picture of why government is necessary to build communities in this country. Matter of fact, this studio is supported by taxpayer dollars, right?
Right.
So government is absolutely critical as it relates to building a strong community. Government creates winners and losers as it relates to communities. We need to understand that. And I think if we start to understand that and start to look at the data and the history and see how they did it for white communities and excluded us, I think that'll cause us to get in the political game and make demands of our politicians that says we want exactly what white people were given, with the exception of slaves. We don't want no slaves. But we want the same government intervention that the white community was given to pull themselves into the middle class. We want the exact same thing. And whether you want to call it welfare or handout, you call it whatever you want to call it. Just give me what you gave them. That's all we're asking. We're not asking for anything special outside of reparations, which is the debt owed. But outside of that, we're saying give us the same thing you gave them. Call it what you want. Call it welfare, call it handout. I don't care what you call it. Just give me what you gave them. That's all we're saying.
Well, that's a mouthful. Man, so much been going on. So I would encourage you to follow up ADOSChicago at gmail.com, ADOSChicago.org. Start watching some of these videos on YouTube to get informed. I know a lot of people don't read as much as they used to, but there's so much information just on YouTube, right?
Yeah, I mean that's what got me into the political space, and that's why I'm working with folks in Chicago to build ADOSChicago, which is, again, it's an organization designed to advocate for reparations for Black Americans, and it's an organization designed to create a Black political agenda for ADOS people in Chicago specifically. So if that's something you're interested in, you can reach out to us at ADOSChicago@gmail.com or ADOSChicago.org. And again, but yeah, that's what got me into the game is YouTube videos.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Watson.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Thank you. And we want to thank you for tuning in. And we always close by saying, good, better, best. Never let it rest until your good is better and your better is best And God will do the rest, especially for ADOS. Until next time, have a super fantastic week.
I like that. I like that.